Hi everyone, this is Miss Lineberger, coming to you from my quarantine state here in my apartment, wearing my Rosie the Riveter shirt from World War II. Of course, this is the famous icon of women working in the factories, but I thought that we can do it was a pretty good motto for us to have right now because this is definitely uncharted territory for all of us. And so this is my first attempt at trying to narrate some of the notes so that you can not only see the notes on the PowerPoints, but also get a little bit more of the explanation that I would have had if I was able to teach it in class. So let's see how this goes. So I'm going to start off with the PowerPoint that we left with the last time we were together. We saw a little bit of this already, so a little bit will be a review, but that's okay because then we'll pick up with new stuff as we go. So we are in the Civil War. 1861 was the first year of the war. So we started with reviewing the border state issue that those border states, remember, were southern states, slave holding states, but they had not seceded and they were always on the verge of seceding. And that always concerned Abraham Lincoln because he felt that if they seceded, then he would inevitably lose the war. So he was always concerned with keeping them from going over to the other side, to the south. So one of the, and remember, Lincoln's number one goal throughout the entire war was to save the Union, was to keep the country together as best as he could. So one of the problems that he encountered, especially in the border states, were the existence of copperheads. Remember, copperheads were people who were Confederate sympathizers. They supported the South. They hated Lincoln. And they were, in some cases, spreading propaganda, in some cases, actually sabotaging Union troops or aiding Confederate troops. So his sort of solution to try to deal with the copperhead problem was to have them thrown in jail. And remember, our Constitution says that anyone who is arrested and thrown in jail has a right to appear before a judge to know what their charges are and to not just be held indefinitely with no reason. And that, hopefully you remember, is called the writ of habeas corpus. But Abraham Lincoln, well, we already looked at that poster before. It's one of the Copperhead propaganda things. So the writ of habeas corpus was suspended during the war. And Lincoln, his excuse for it was to say that he was violating one law in an effort to try to save the entire Constitution. So he felt that it was justified under these extraordinary situations in order to protect the country, to protect the public safety. That was what he said as his reason for suspending habeas corpus. Sorry, I'm still learning how to kind of navigate this. So one little side note, I think it's interesting that we've had a similar sort of proposal out there just recently in the things that are going on in our country today with the COVID-19 pandemic, that there was a proposal by the Justice Department that the United States would be suspending some of their judicial processes. And that meant that people who have been detained and are being held in court awaiting their trial or awaiting their charges are just being held there in court or held there in jail, sorry. And that is essentially denying habeas corpus. And when questioned about that, the Justice Department and the President have stated that this is an unusual circumstance due to the pandemic, due to the public safety being in jeopardy, that, sometimes our civil liberties can be denied or postponed in this case. And so I think it's just an interesting thing to think about because we talked about this right before leaving. Is it okay for our rights to be denied under certain circumstances, especially without, going through Congress or anything like that? Can a president or can the president's administration determine when rights can potentially be suspended? So just kind of tying that to issues today. But let's move on. So the first major battle of the war was the Battle of Bull Run. And the main thing that you should have gotten about this already in your notes is it was the first major battle of the war, happened in Manassas, Virginia. Manassas is the town right outside Washington, D.C. And you may remember that a lot of people from Washington, D.C. actually came out and watched the battle like a spectator sport, which is just so very bizarre. But leading the forces of the Battle of Bull Run for the Union was Irwin McDowell, and for the Confederates, Thomas Jackson and Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. And in the early moments of this battle, it was not looking good for the Confederates, and there was desire potentially to start backing down or retreating. And that's when the order came from Jackson for them not to retreat, for them to hold steady and to not back down. And someone said of Thomas Jackson, said, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall." And that's where he got his nickname, Stonewall Jackson. So that came from this battle. It did end up being a Confederate victory. And some of the significances of this battle, other than it being the first major battle of the war, were also some of the implications afterwards. A lot of the Confederates kind of thought that they had won. They'd won the war. It was all done. But for the Union, Abraham Lincoln put out a call for new enlistments to join. And so it definitely was not over. So hopefully you got in your notes that Lincoln called for more enlistments to the war, and we'll move on from there. Let's see. Here's pictures from the Battle of Bull Run and talking about people coming out to watch the battle. We've talked about this before, that the strategy that the Confederates had was to basically just not lose. Remember, they just had to defend, hold their ground, and not get conquered by the North. And so it was going to be a defensive war and a war of attrition, which, remember, a war of attrition means who can outlast the other. Because remember, if the North just gives up, then the South has won. And so that's what they're counting on. And that's a good thing for the South in the beginning. The problem with this becoming a war of attrition is that the longer the war goes on, the harder it is for the South to actually carry it out because they don't have the resources and supplies that they need. So they attempted to get more supplies and get some support from foreign allies by sending some diplomats on board the British ship, the Trent. But when that ship was on its way to Britain, it was attacked, captured by the U.S., the North, their Navy, and hostages were taken. And the significance of this was that it almost led to Great Britain declaring war on the North, the United States, as well. And Abraham Lincoln said, he can't fight two wars. He said one war at a time. And so he ordered that his Navy release the captives, the hostages, and the whole thing simmered down. And that was a pretty big deal because it prevented the South from getting the support from Great Britain that they wanted, and it also prevented the North from having to fight two wars. So the whole crisis ended up being averted. All right, in Tennessee, General Grant is leading the forces there, and the two early battles were the battles of Fort Henry and Donelson. Those were two forts that were located on rivers in Tennessee, strategic rivers, so that's why they were pretty significant of their location on those rivers. Grant captured those forts unconditionally. Remember, he got the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, meaning that they had to surrender and they get no terms that they would be granted. And then they proceeded south to the little town of Shiloh, where another major battle of the war would take place. The Battle of Shiloh was a surprise attack. The South surprised the Union forces there and attacked, but the Union was able to counter their attack. It ended up being a very bloody battle. It lasted for about 2 weeks. But the significance of the battle, and it's kind of behind my face on here, so I'm going to scroll up a little bit, is that it showed the need for better defensive tactics so that you don't get surprise attacked, So both sides started using more scouts, patrols, defensive strategies, spies, stuff like that to try to avoid, those surprise attacks. So moving on, as you can see, the Bloody Pond of Shiloh, they called it the Bloody Pond because of so many casualties that happened at this battle. They said that the water of the pond turned red with blood. 23,000 people killed in this battle. And it did end up being pretty much a draw, not really a major win for either side. The more significant thing was the defensive strategy necessity. The Peninsular Campaign, this was an effort to try to capture, for the North, to try to capture the Confederate capital. Remember, the Confederate capital was in Richmond, Virginia. And so the North was always trying to capture that capital. However, the North is being led by General George McClellan. And you may remember, McClellan sucks. But on the other hand, the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia was led by Robert E. Lee, who was widely known to be the greatest general on either side, and of course his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson. And because of their superior leadership, they were able to defend the capital of Richmond. In fact, so this campaign goes on for months, but really it goes on for the whole war in efforts to try to gain advantage in Virginia and try to get closer and closer to Richmond. But Lee was always able to outmaneuver the Union forces and use his better strategic knowledge to defend that capital. And of course, the Confederates were often trying to capture the Union capital, which of course was Washington, D.C. But the bigger thing was for them to defend their capital. And so the North was never able to capture the capital of Richmond, Virginia, up until they finally captured it a couple of weeks before the end of the war, which was 4 years later. So that's how long they were able to defend that. So Robert E. Lee knows that they really only have to defend in order to win. They only have to hold out. But he also understands that this war cannot go on for too long, or the South won't be able to manage it. So even though he didn't have to invade, by the end of 1862, maybe it's a combination of his own belief in his abilities, but also even more so probably his knowledge that he needed to get this war over quicker. He decides to abandon the strategy of defending and actually invade into Union territory. So he leads his army up into Maryland. Of course, you remember that Maryland was considered a southern state, but it is part of the Union. So he is going into Union territory by heading up into Maryland. He believes that if he can win a battle on their territory, then that would lead to them giving up quicker. He also was hoping to get more resources by going up into that territory to be able to feed his men, and potentially, get other resources they may need, shoes and, stuff like that. And he believed also that if he could win up in Union territory, it might also inspire other countries to come and help them quicker, because at this point they're still waiting on support from other countries and they're in dire need of it. So I'm going to stop this and we'll pick up on the next one because I'm out of time. I only get 15 minutes. So see you on the next video.